Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by Telos, where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, including here in the U.S., wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Cattabot, checking in from Washington, D.C. I have to say, today's conversation is a particularly special one for me personally. We were joined by the brilliant Dr. Deshaun Dyson, Director of Restore US for Telos, and Dr. Jemar Tisby, New York Times bestselling author, national speaker, and public historian on a mission to deliver truths from the Black experience with depth and clarity. In today's conversation, we discuss the inspiring and challenging history from Dr. Tisby's newest book, The Spirit of Justice: True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. We covered King beyond the quotable, sanitized version we learned in the history books, the great man myth and the centrality of Coretta Scott King to his story, and the broader story of civil rights, and what our opportunities are today to do the work of justice in our communities and in our nation. This conversation was so special to me, though, because it was listening to Jemar on Pass the Mic, the podcast he co-hosts with Tyler Burns at The Witness. Years ago, that was a huge part of my own journey in peacemaking, of exploring our call to pursue justice, equity, and freedom within our own country. It's funny the ways history can complete some circles in ways you never imagined. Also, Deshaun and Jemar are close friends who go way back, and at the beginning of the show, they share an amazing exchange on the GOAT of the NBA. So you can't miss that. This conversation is rich with wisdom, history, insight, and invitations to do the work of peacemaking, and I know you will enjoy it. On to the show. All right, I am here with Dr. Deshaun Dyson. Where are you checking in from?
Jackson, Mississippi, Jacktown.
And Dr. Jemar Tisby, where are you checking in from?
I am calling in from Louisville, Kentucky.
Excellent. Well,
that's how they told me to say it.
Louisville, Kentucky?
Louisville, like you
That's
got
right.
marbles in your mouth. But hey, I am culturally adaptable.
That's an important skill. Well, folks, I am so grateful to have you having this conversation with you both today. I know you have a rich friendship, which hopefully will be out on display for our network to get to see you both interact. But my first question is actually a get to know you question for both of you. And it's, who is your favorite NBA star? Who is the GOAT?
Oh, this is easy for me because I grew up near Chicago, Illinois in the 1990s, the Chicago Bulls 6-peat era. And there is no other question. There's no debate, conversation. I don't want to hear the haters hate, because the GOAT is, and for all time will be, the one and only Michael Jordan.
That's right.
That's it.
That's the correct answer.
Mic drop.
Definitely. Absolutely.
I would hope that Dr. Tisby's skills and credentials would give him
Here we go.
Frameworks and tools to break through the propaganda and the nuances of factors that would account for how Jordan manages to lose in like earlier rounds of the playoffs, but we don't count those. But my favorite player is the best player that ever played, won multiple championships with multiple teams. The GOAT, my king, LeBron James.
My king.
Okay, see, you used a critical word there, the best. So I'm going to use a framework that I borrow from my other podcast co-host, Tyler Burns. He talks about the GOAT and the boat. The GOAT and the boat. So the GOAT, greatest of all time. The boat, best of all time. So in that framework, we could argue that LeBron James is the boat in all kinds of numerical category numbers and whatnot, longevity in the game, all those things. Best, you could very well make a good argument. But the greatest, which to me transcends the numbers, transcends the statistics, transcends the era, the GOAT will still be Michael Jordan. How's that for you? Boom, dropping knowledge.
You're reaching as far as your guy did on Space Jam to make that free throw dunk that he did against the Monstars. So
No way.
I am unmoved by
my goodness. Okay.
your splicing of categories.
I see how this is going to go.
All I'm seeing, you know what? I'm hearing some reconciliation happening. I'm hearing some
It's one-sided.
peacemaking.
It's one-sided.
No, there's a winner and a loser here for sure. Still, there's a correct
Unmoved.
answer and an incorrect answer. I went to UNC Chapel Hill, so of course, Jemar, I am with you. Michael Jordan is the GOAT.
That is great. Very good. Well, end of interview. This was great, guys.
Unfortunately, you're outvoted, Deshaun. That's how we work here in this democracy on this check-in call. But I am so excited for this conversation, particularly Jemar, because you just released a new book that everyone listening to this podcast needs to read. The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. Folks, I just finished this. I listened to it on audiobook. I thought you did a great job narrating this book. It was very well said. That's probably the years of training on your podcasts, which folks should listen to as well. But before we dive into the book, I would love to hear just a little bit about who is Jemar. What does it mean to be Jemar? Why did you decide to write this book now?
I am interested in cultivating joyful change makers. And that is a lot of my personality. I like to have fun. I like to enjoy the world that God created for us. And I want that for other people. So that means I have to work for justice, because there's all kinds of things going on in the world that make it difficult for us to enjoy the world. And I think really the core of joy as we're created is to be co-creators with God. So immediately after God creates humankind in God's own image, God gives them a command: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, right? Like, yo, here's the playground. Go and make stuff. And I think we all have a purpose for being here. I think we all co-create with God in various ways. It can be anything from accounting to poetry to, sports, whatever it might be. And so what I want to do is help people find and fulfill that purpose with joy. But to get there, we have to tackle the systems and the structures that prevent us from doing that. So that animates a lot of what I do. And my focus, of course, is racial justice from a historical and a faith-based perspective.
I love that. Joy as this kind of telos, as this end goal, where we're headed. Yep, there it is.
See what you did there.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do here in our work, is point people to a future in which joy is possible, because everyone has access to freedom and dignity and security. And it takes work to sit in the darkness, sit in the brokenness, the pain, the injustice now, in order to get us towards that new future. So you wrote this book that's helping orient us to the possibility of joy through justice. What is the spirit of justice? What are you hoping to accomplish in this book?
There's a lot of ways to define the spirit of justice. It occurs to me as a historian, as I look back through the past, unfortunately, evil is unsurprising. Unfortunately, it's rather predictable. It's always going to show up. To me, what is much more surprising, astounding even, is that there are always people pushing back against the injustice. No matter how heavy the load, no matter how acute the persecution, there are always people who find some energy, some strength within them to assert their dignity. And that is the spirit of justice. It is truly the fingerprint of God on all of our souls that says that we have dignity and we deserve to be treated as such. I also have 2 kids' books out that are based on the spirit of justice. There's Stories of the Spirit of Justice, which is a picture book for kids 4 to 7 years old. And then there's, that's I Am the Spirit of Justice. Stories of the Spirit of Justice is the young reader's version for like tweens, 8 to 12 or so. And in those books, I define the spirit of justice as the that's not fair spirit. You know how kids are really great at pointing out different treatment, and they look and see you say something or do something with that person and not to them. And they say, that's not fair. And it is that sense of right and wrong, of morality, of a childlike view of the world, how we should treat all people fairly. And that too can be a definition of the spirit of justice.
So, Jemar, before I read the book, I actually had seen some of your commentary where you talked about really digging into, some of your skill set and tools as a historian. And so for people who are expecting sort of a flyby approach to some of the people, like they weren't going to get like a a glance over of these figures. And I found it really helpful that like you didn't shy away from like the richness, but the difficulty of navigating like what the spirit looks like in their life at their time, in their age, in their situation. And so some of the fluidity of like the nature of the spirit, like can you talk about that and why you chose that framing of it?
Yeah. So there's sort of two parts that I hear to your question. One, there was this early book review on like Amazon or something where someone generally liked the book, but it wasn't what they expected, and their frustration is it had a lot of historical information. Like I don't know what they were expecting, or if they've read any of my other stuff, but that's kind of like part of the brand. Like you're going to get history there, but I honestly don't think this reader understood like I have a PhD in history. I'm a researcher and I bring that to bear. So I'm really proud of this book in terms of the historical research. If you look at the endnotes, you're going to find a lot of primary source documents, particularly like journals and autobiographies and memoirs. In other words, the words of the people themselves. And so it's not mediated through some other interpreter. And I did that because this is a story not just about people who resisted racism, but they resisted racism because of their faith. And so I needed to find the connection between their faith and their activism. Oftentimes that wasn't as public. And so I have to go to their own thoughts, their own words, their own musings about themselves and their own lives. So it's really, really cool stuff. But there's going to be real hard hitting history in here. So just be prepared. To your second question, like there is a breadth and a fluidity and a flexibility of what I term the spirit of justice and how that shows up. So in the first chapter, I talk about resistance, advocacy, and activism as sort of a taxonomy, a loose taxonomy for the different kinds of actions. And really it's a spectrum from less intentional to more intentional, less explicit to more explicit. So I talk about resistance as anything we do as human beings to assert our human dignity in the face of oppression. And that doesn't necessarily have to be overt or intentional. So, for instance, taking a nap can be resistance in a world that wants to exploit your labor. Having a family. I talk about Anthony, Isabella, and William. William is the child of Anthony and Isabella who came straight from Africa and then had William in North America. And in a sense, you could call William the first truly African-American child of British colonial Virginia. And they're included in the book because having a family and saying that there's future here and there's hope here can be an act of resistance. Now, there's another level. There's resistance, but there's also advocacy. This is more intentional. And so advocacy looks like amplifying a social justice cause. Amplifying can be hashtag activism, which is not meaningless. It's not the end, but it can be helpful. It can be writing about something. It can be donating to a cause. Most of us are advocates for something. And what that role is, it's an intentional support of a cause, but it's support. Then there's activism. And so activism is what we generally think of when we think of protests, marches, boycotts, getting arrested, putting your literal life on the line, or dedicating your life to a cause. The folks at Telos could be considered activists because y'all are doing this full-time front lines, teaching people and educating people, all of that stuff. So there is a spectrum of activity included in the spirit of justice that we see throughout history.
I appreciate that response so much because so much of what we are doing at TELUS, especially through the Restore US program, first on this history point, is people don't know the history. We don't know our own history as a nation. We have these differing facts, right? And so that creates a situation where we don't know how to envision a future because we don't know our past. And so to say, there's too much history is really quite ironic because it reveals a lot about what you believe about the present and where we can go together towards justice, towards this possibility.
As a nation, we are very ahistorical. As a church, I think it's even worse.
Oof.
I think Christians are even worse at history. And I'm not even talking about world history, right? US history. And we can even just talk about one era, civil rights history. You can talk about any civil war. So part of the issue, misinformation. David Barton is an absolute bane of any legitimate historian's existence. If you don't know who David Barton is, Google him, but basically he is this pseudo historian who traffics in whitewashing history and far right propaganda. The reason he's so dangerous is because he's got a huge body of content that has been spread nationally and internationally in homeschool curricula, classical school curricula, Christian schools. And so it's not just that Christians don't know the history, it's that there's large swaths of Christians who get bad history that has to be undone and retaught, right? And then there's just the general ignorance of people. Like, we don't have in our Sunday schools, like, US history from a faith perspective, or the history of Christianity in this country, or anything around that. And so that's one of my passions with these books, like The Spirit of Justice. I want church folks to read this because church folks need to know this history, because guess what? It informs your faith and it shapes your pursuit of justice.
Oh, that's so good. There's two layers of learning that needs to be done. It's not only correcting the ignorance, it's correcting the misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
That's so important for us to hear. And I love this vision of getting people in churches to be reading about the history of saints in our own nation who have pursued justice, who have pursued out of their love for God and for their neighbor, justice and flourishing, right? That's so important. To your point about our lack of historical understanding, our misinformation, I want to talk about Dr. King in particular. We are recording this conversation just a few days before MLK Jr. Day, 2025. This conversation, for folks who are listening, it's after we've celebrated. But in your book, you talk to us a lot about how we don't really know what King faced in his life. We don't really know truly what he stood for and its expansiveness, and how much in particular, and you point this out, he was disregarded, hated, vilified during his time. Tell us more about his life, especially beyond the quotable king, as you say.
Yes. I have a chapter in the book titled Beyond the Quotable King. And it was really interesting because historians have this aversion to what they call, quote, the great man history. And so that's the idea of telling the history of this country through the quote unquote great men who are mostly white, and they're all men. And King sort of falls into that as this sort of larger than life figure. And so I was a little bit conflicted on having a whole chapter dedicated to him when every other chapter is a mixture of people. It's several folks profiled. But I wanted to do this chapter Beyond the Quotable King because he is so well known. And it's often the figures who we think we know the best that we misunderstand the most. It's often the people who we think we know the best who we misunderstand the most. So I wanted to provide some of that corrective. So I think first off, and the way I begin the chapter is reminding people that MLK was first and foremost a preacher. So here's a quote I would like to read from a sermon that he gave in Chicago in 1967, the year before he was assassinated. And he preached, he said, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and it still remains my greatest commitment. You know, actually, all that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry." We could spend the rest of the podcast unpacking that quote. There is so much in here about the contrast between white evangelicalism, who always told me, you know, racial justice, that's a distraction from the gospel. And King says, this is part of my ministry. But what I want to focus on is even people of good faith and goodwill toward King, we generally remember his activism, but we tend to overlook what animated his activism, which was his faith, his pursuit of Jesus, right? And we'll mention, oh, he was a preacher and all that, but we don't really, in our time, dwell with the fact that he felt a holy burden from God to work for human dignity. And we call him a civil rights leader. He's a human rights activist, right? Especially toward the end of his life, you see his global view, his view of the poor, his view of cross-racial cooperation, all of that. So he was a human rights activist, which stems from his understanding of human dignity, which comes from his understanding of Christianity. So I just think that's one of the ways that we need to get beyond the quotable king and understand, look, this man wasn't just an organizer, a protester, a civil rights leader. He says in his own words, before all of that, I was a preacher.
You're reminding me, Jamar, I saw an interview with Vincent Harding, who wrote some speeches and was a colleague, friend of Dr. King, and also did an introduction to Where Do We Go From Here? And it's reminding me of two things. One, sort of like I've sat under your preaching, like I know how, like, you're formed by a very spiritual, orientation. But that was one of the things that Dr. Harding, I believe, said that you have to understand. He described King showing up in Watts and seeing protests and seeing young people, and like there's this lens that we have of, again, activism, of activity, of a social movement. And he said what Dr. King saw, he saw as a pastor, and he saw as, how do you speak into this in a way that gives life. And so, as a way of, even if on the back end of that, the words seem very surgical in terms of, okay, we need to indict ourselves and indict a society that's allowing conditions to exist for these things to happen. Even his contemporaries were constantly pointing to the fact of, trying to make him, these labels that he constantly spent time defending himself from, which you have felt some of that pushback yourself, of the Marxists and the communists and all these things. When he said it himself, and those who knew him best will tell you, this was a pastor who was seeing the world through the eyes of brokenness and sadness and, human harm and hurt. And so to start by sort of reimagining, what does that look like? And again, the spirit may compel you to turn that into a certain kind of action, you know, doesn't make it lose credibility, or does, it should actually, as Christians, catalyze us to think through, we have some freedom to express what we're seeing through some action that may seem radical.
And we ought to, yeah. And so I begin the chapter, King the Preacher. I end the chapter with a section called The Unpopular King. The Unpopular King. I just think it's so fascinating how anyone across the ideological spectrum will look back generally positive, at least publicly, on King. And here are some statistics that demonstrate how unpopular he was. So in 1964, which was the same year that Congress passed the famed Civil Rights Act, there was a poll in which Americans asked which three people did they have the least respect for. It's kind of a funny poll question, but whatever. They asked the three people they had the least respect for. MLK came in second place as the person who they had the least respect for. The only person lower than him was George Wallace, the notorious racist and segregationist. That was in 1964. Now, in 1966, there was a Harris poll that indicated 50% of white Americans thought King was hurting the cause of Black civil rights. Hurting the cause, probably because they thought he was too militant. They didn't like his quote unquote law breaking, which included being arrested because, local authorities would create these last minute injunctions to prevent marches and protests, whatever. And then this was really sobering. Right after his assassination, 31% of people said that King brought his death on himself. So they blamed the victim, 31%. And then less than half of the respondents in that poll, 43%, said they were even sad or angry at his murder. Less than half said they were sad or angry. And then we're doing this right around the MLK holiday. Right after it was passed, which was reluctant on the part of Reagan and it could not have happened without the advocacy of Coretta Scott King, who we'll talk about later. But even when they approved the federal holiday honoring King, public opinion was split. 48% said they didn't want a national holiday for King, and 47% said they did. So it was not some unanimous consensus that we should honor this man. And this was in the 80s. This is a decade and a half after he's dead. So yeah, he was very controversial, if you want to put it that way. But I just want to highlight, like, there was far from unanimous approval of King, whether in his life or even after his death.
That's such an interesting and sobering set of statistics, as you mentioned, and it makes me think about all of the people in our moment today who are speaking about justice, who are moving with the spirit of justice, and yet we are perhaps blind to see what they're doing. We refuse to hear them, to give them a word. We, label them in certain camps, just like MLK was 60, 70 years ago, right? And yet, or 50, 60 years ago. I think of particularly folks from the Palestinian Christian community, Munthir Isaac, right now, who's speaking with a bold voice for justice for his people in the face of what's happening in ongoing genocide in Gaza. And so there's some self-interrogation for us to do learning this history about how do we show up in our own communities, in our own context today, being attentive to the spirit of justice and those leaders who are calling us to a vision of the kingdom of God and of flourishing for all people. But I think there's also something interesting to say about how quickly a public imagination can change, right? Because the era I grew up in, every city had an MLK, Jr. Boulevard. I live in DC, across the street from the memorial that honors him and his legacy. And yes, there's some, ahistorical, narrative that's happening, but there's also a generation like mine who's growing up, getting to hear him and being challenged to go deeper into the deeper stories, into who he truly was, to the power of narrative and story to reshape our imaginations, which is something we're going to talk about later too. But I want to come back to Coretta, who you mentioned just a second ago, and this great man myth that historians like to point out, that we often like to think of our history in the lens of these special, charismatic, particularly white men. And yet King Martin wouldn't have been who he was without Coretta. Tell us about her, not only in how she made Martin who he was, but also her own activism and her own work that she did after his death.
Absolutely. We have to understand that Martin and Coretta were a package deal in activism. And it's really mainly because of very antiquated patriarchal ideas about the role of women in the public square that she wasn't more prominent during the civil rights movement. And, she chose to play that role of mother, supporter, someone holding down the fort at home, and built a legacy through her children. But we should not interpret that as any sort of deficiency on her part of intelligence, wisdom, passion for social justice. So most people know very little about Coretta Scott King. She was raised on a farm and was a country girl. They had cows and pigs and chicken and all of that stuff. But she was always a very precocious child, extremely intelligent, extremely interested in learning. One of the neat facts that I learned while researching her, she graduated valedictorian of her high school. She was a brilliant student. And she also was exposed to pacifism very early on and nonviolence. And so she heard Bayard Rustin, who was one of the architects of the March on Washington decades before, and was exposed to this idea of how conflict could be resolved without war or bloodshed, in her words. And then, of course, she discovers she has this incredible singing ability, gets a prestigious appointment and admission to the conservatory, Boston Conservatory of Music, where she meets MLK while he's up there for school. At first, she wasn't that impressed with him. He was short, He seemed kind of slick, kind of a ladies' man. She wasn't quite sure about it. But when they started talking and found that they had this mutual passion for justice, there was a resonance there. And King knew very early on that he wanted to marry her. They had some issues with their parents accepting it and all of that stuff. One of the critical moments that centers on Coretta Scott King that made MLK's public work possible was when a bomb was thrown at their house. And this happened a few times. But there was one incident in particular very early on. This is during the Montgomery bus boycott. It's about a month, 2 months into it, the end of January of 1956. And Coretta Scott King was in the living room of their house with a friend chatting, and they heard a thump. By that time, just 2 months in, they are already conditioned to stop, drop, and roll, basically, to respond. So they, as soon as they heard that, they ran to the back. Sure enough, it was a bomb, and it blew up in their house, rocked the whole house, blasted a hole in the front wall. Their infant, Yolanda, their first child, was in the house, woke her up crying, of course. And then they made it out alive, just, barely. And so what strikes me about that moment is, in that moment, she would have been perfectly justified as a human being, as a mother, to say, oh no, we out. Like, they almost killed us. And let's go back to Atlanta. Let's be closer to your parents in a bigger city and work from there. She didn't do that. She wrote in one of her memoirs, in Montgomery, when tragedy hit, when I was tested, I found that the fear had left. It had been overcome by faith. That's the other part we need to remember about Coretta Scott King. She too was a woman of faith, and her faith overcame her fear. And in that critical moment, January 1956, if she had said to King, we got to go, there might not be an MLK leading the Montgomery bus boycott through its conclusion and becoming a nationally known figure. But because of her courage in that moment, because of the spirit of justice in that moment, we now see the trajectory of their lives. And that was all due to Coretta Scott King's choice of courage in that moment.
So I'd love you to tie something together for us. Recently, Fannie Lou Hamer was given Presidential Medal of Freedom. Hope I got every piece of that right. And it's something I'm working on an article on right now about the idea that, and DCAT, you alluded to this earlier, we tend to need like legitimizing that comes from various places. And so King now gets his streets. He gets his holiday after political posturing and different things that have to happen while he's despised and hated. And one of the things that, I often say when I'm having conversations about King is that, like, he was murdered. Like, I'll just repeat that over and over again because it really brings home to me like where the sentiment was on him. How do you connect, as you've written a book that talks about this spirit that has existed, and you even go back to, Africa, like this spiritual nature that some of us try to divide from ourselves. Like, we try to make a Christianity that's devoid of like a spirit that is at work and compelling us to do things, and empowering the Fannie Lou Hamer that now gets recognition because the right people heard about her and learned about her, where there are these countless people throughout history who are unnamed in the textbooks because they didn't get the validation. Um, what do you say, one, as a historian, as we're doing a better job of addressing those stories? And what is the charge to a community now that, even if you're not the great man who is recognized for how the spirit is compelling you to move today, to push forward with what you're being called to do?
First of all, Fannie Lou Hamer is one of my historical heroes. Of course, she was born and raised in the Mississippi Delta and never left it, even after she became nationally known as a civil rights activist. And I lived in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side for 15 years. So that was a story near and dear, and I'm glad she's finally getting that recognition. But to your point, most people go unnamed. I would say, in the spirit of justice, I profile over 50 different people. For the average person, probably 80 to 90% of those people they're going to hear about for the first time. They're not going to know about the Sister Thea Bowmans, who's another Mississippi woman. They're not going to know about Anna Arnold Hedgeman. They're not going to know about his name is Douglas, but not related to Frederick Douglass. So there's a lot of folks who go unnamed. One of the things that I try to highlight in the book are those lesser known figures or prominent figures like MLK, but different sides of them that we don't acknowledge, right? But all of that gets to, I think, a deeper point. People have to be convinced that doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing is a worthwhile endeavor. In other words, you can't be in this work of justice and be motivated by a sense of recognition or wanting people to thank you. Nice if you can get it. Even better if you can get it in your lifetime. But there's no guarantee. You actually have to be convinced and convicted in your soul that this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do, no matter what happens. And by the way, that's who history remembers. We remember the people who courageously confronted injustice, not the people who capitulated and compromised with it. So that's a lesson for right now. As we see this new regime take power, we see all these dominoes fall in terms of wealthy people, business people, politicians, entertainers, public figures of all kinds, and even neighbors, friends, and church members go along with an anti-democratic, white supremacist, white Christian nationalist regime and policies because it's easier or it's safer or it's more predictable, it's more comfort, or they get something out of it, some sort of benefit, whether that be platform or money or acceptance in a community. History doesn't tend to remember those people. History remembers the people who at great sacrifice chose to confront the injustice and the oppression. So we're going to talk way more about Michelle Obama not attending the inauguration than all the people who did. We're going to talk way more about the Liz Cheneys who lost her political career. And I don't agree with a lot of her politics, but on this one thing around January 6th and the attempted insurrection, she stood up. We're going to talk about her a lot more than the actual individual insurrectionists, right? So I just want to say to people, like, if you're interested in building your legacy, it's the people who confronted injustice and oppression, not the people who capitulated, who history remembers the most.
That's such a word for us. I'm thinking of a conversation I had recently on the show with Dr. Andrew DeCourt, who wrote a really beautiful book about the Beatitudes. And he says that this, series of blessings Jesus is calling us towards as we're living in a world of violence and injustice and what it means to be humanely happy, it points us to this climax of being peacemakers, that this is what we are here to do, to be justice seekers, to be people who repair brokenness and seek healing. And yet what comes next? Blessed are the persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? That doing this work necessarily comes at a cost. If you're doing it honestly, if you're doing it in the way that Jesus is actually calling us to do it, that it will come with a response. Because the world is content, the world is happy to keep these systems of injustice going. And it doesn't want them to stop because there's power, there's control, there's comfort in the midst of those things for these people who are holding this up and for the systems. And so when you challenge it, you will face resistance. But what comes with that? Inheritance, the kingdom of heaven, right? A new future of healing and belonging. And that's what we get to look forward to. That's what comes on the other side, as you're reminding us, Dr. Tisby.
What I love about that part on the Beatitudes is I've preached many sermons on this about being blessed in the midst of persecution. That word in Greek, makarios, can also be translated happy are they. going back to the joyful change makers, right? Like if you are standing for righteousness in an unrighteous world, you will face persecution, but there's blessing in it. There's happiness for you in it. There's joy in it. Why? Not because external matters are all fine and dandy. You might be in prison. You might be losing your job. You might be facing all kinds of ostracism and rejection from your community. So where's the joy in that? Where's the happiness? Where's the blessing in that? You know you are on God's side. Not that God is on your side. You're on God's side. You're in the center of God's will, fighting for justice, working and making peace. And you're doing the right thing for the sake that it's the right thing, because it's God's will, right? And that's where the happiness is. That's where the blessing comes in. That is a joy that the world didn't give and the world can't take away, as the saints used to say, right? So, that to me is one of the things, if it's not missing in the current social justice movement, then I'm not hearing enough about it. There is no guarantee that we will win in any earthly sense. There's no guarantee that the policy will get changed, the law will get passed, the politician will be elected, whatever it is. And so what happens when you face defeat in those ways? What keeps you going? Well, you're doing the right thing for its own sake. And there is a happiness and a joy, a satisfaction, dare I say, a peace, because we can't be peacemakers in the world unless we make peace with ourselves. There is a peace that comes with knowing that you are fulfilling your purpose by following in the footsteps of Jesus, which is the path of justice. There's my sermon for you. This podcast episode.
Keep it up. Man, that's so good. To come back to that, the idea of courage that you talk about Coretta Scott King having in the face of the violence that she experienced firsthand, right? This life-threatening situation, yet the courage she had in the midst of it to do the right thing because of the peace with which she had with herself and with God. I want to talk now about, in light of this opportunity to joy, this invitation into happiness that we have, what our opportunities are now in this moment, in light of everything that's happening in our nation, across the world. Yesterday was the inauguration. Many of us had in mind the events of 4 years ago. You referenced earlier with the insurrection. As we're recording this, we don't know what will happen, but we know what it means for the future. I want to hear from you. What are the opportunities for those listening right now to be a part of this work of justice in the context we're about to step into?
The opportunity is urgency. 2025, this next regime, I don't call it an administration, I call it a regime that's coming into power. Now is the time to pull out all the stops, to take off the parking brake, and to accelerate all of your justice efforts while taking care of yourself, right? There's this two sides of the coin. But I say to people, what are you waiting for? Now is the time. Whatever it is, listen, it's just like anything else. Like if you want to lose weight or get in shape or get better at a sport or playing piano, you don't think about, playing the entire concerto from memory. You think about playing the next note correctly, the next line, right? The next meter, whatever it is. I'm not a musician, as you can tell. Like the work of justice is one step at a time, but I'm telling folks, like, take the steps and keep going. And the word is, don't be discouraged by the persecution. Don't think that you're doing something wrong because of the persecution. It could be a sign that you're doing the right thing. So in other words, when you actually really start to get going on this journey of justice, whatever that looks like for an individual, it's going to be different for all of us. When you really start to get going, you will face opposition. Don't let the fear of that opposition prevent you from moving forward or taking the next step, nor when it comes, forget the blessing. Blessed are you when you're persecuted. Why? For righteousness' sake. And how do we do that? Well, number one, community. You got to get together with people. So go on a Restory journey with Telos. Why? Because you're going to connect with people on that journey who you'll keep in touch with and can encourage you. If your local church is not the community, then form it, because the church is not just a place, it's a people. So you know people, you scroll through your contacts list right now, and there are 3 or 4 people, you're like, okay, those are my ride or dies. I know I can count on them for this. Put them all in the same text message and be like, hey, I just want to keep in touch during this next 100 days, whatever's going to happen, right? And see what happens. So there are tools, there are ways we can do it. But what I'm saying is go for it. And most people don't understand how dire the situation is. I mean, as we speak, there are fires raging in Los Angeles. In most other times in our modern political history, what would be the response of any and all politicians? Sympathy, support, all of that stuff. Now we're talking about, well, there are conditions on federal aid to help, right? You got to show XYZ things from this regime. So you're going to have to bend the knee, check the boxes, all of that is the most basic human response to tragedy, is to come together. Now we have leaders in office who can't even do that basic thing. There's a basic lack of, not only that, there's a basic lack of truth, and there's a basic lack of qualifications, and there is, I would dare say, a maliciousness among many of the officials who they're proposing to be in office. Why? What do I mean by malicious? They deliberately want to dismantle the levers of democracy in order to enshrine minority rule, as they call it. So they don't have to ever win a majority of the populace. Their policies don't have to be popular. They don't ever have to win a majority of votes. They can so structure it during these years in power that they'll stay in power. And Deshaun, you know this, Mississippi is a great example of this. Highest proportion of Black population of any state. And yet it's a supermajority Republican, where we know most Black people vote Democratic. And there are all kinds of policies that are very detrimental to the poor. Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the union, right? And then Black people even poorer. So it happens. It is happening at a state level. Now we've got the same kinds of spirit and actors at the federal level. So I say all that to say the urgency is real. MLK in 1963 in his I Have a Dream speech toward the beginning, not the end part where we talk about, people be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Before you get to that part, he talks about the fierce urgency of now. And I love that phrase because it's so eloquent. And folks, we are living in the fierce urgency of now. So pull out all the stops, take the action, take the steps, let courage push through that fear, and know that blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake.
Deshaun, anything to add there? What's the opportunity right now?
No, I think, we're currently as an organization working on telling the where do we go from here story, because I think even as people watched and kept their eyes on things like past legislation and successful or accomplished and finished protests of the time, there were still rampant disparities, not just in the South. You still had, dead civil rights workers. You still had slum living conditions and these urban centers. And to his dying day, it was still like, where do we go from here? And what do we do today? And what are we thinking about tomorrow? So I think that impassioned charge, that spirit-filled charge and challenge by Brother Dr. Tisby there is good for our souls in these times.
We need it. We need to take that next step. We need that call to urgency. The moment is calling us into that. And I believe Christ is calling us into that, as you said, to be peacemakers, to suffer persecution for justice' sake. That's what our invitation is right now, folks. And we want to be walking alongside you in it. We're in there. We're in the trenches with you. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, to email, connect with us on social media, connect with Dr. Tisby on social media, follow his Substack. There are many, many ways to get involved, to learn more, and to get to work, to get active in your communities. First of which is buying The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance, wherever you get your books. Well, thank you so much, Jemar. It's been a blast having you with us.
Thank you for the opportunity and for all the good work you all are doing. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you next time.